Hey guys. All right, so it's Friday. At least it's Friday for you guys. It's Thursday afternoon while I'm making this, and I want to talk about some of our ladies in Christian theology. And so to do that, we're going to talk about Julian of Norwich today, and this is going to set us up a little bit to talk about Catherine of Siena. On the other side of this. Okay, so here's where you're gonna start. You can do one of two things. You can pause the video in just a second and go and get some biographical information related to Julian of Norwich, and get an understanding of who she is and what transpired in her life. Or you can watch this first and then go get the biographical sketch. Doesn't matter to me which, you just need to do both. What I need for you to do is take some notes on what we're talking about here. And that'll get us through the concept for today, and then you guys can work on your projects. Before we jump into Julian specifically, and before you pause and go get some biographical information or take the notes on the video, whichever you pick, we need to acknowledge that whether we're talking about Joan of Arc, Julian of Norwich, or Catherine of Siena, there is an element to talking about them as mystics. Not mystics in the sense of the mystery cults we talked about earlier in Hellenistic philosophy, but similar. These individuals have experiences of the divine, of the spiritual, of fill in the blank, that alters their perspective on what we are looking at when we come to the text of Scripture or when we come to the Christian life. And Joan of Arc's experiences with her vision and the voices of Michael and St. Catherine and St. Margaret catalyze her to a life, to an action, and to a devotion to Christ alone. And what we're going to see with Julian of Norwich and what we're going to see with Catherine of Siena is that their experiences, visionary or otherwise, catalyze them to a devotion and to a description and to an understanding that is unique, is nuanced, is presented in really important ways and in vocabulary that's grounded in the Scripture in certain places, and challenges some of our sort of preconceived ideas and understandings. And I think it's healthy to listen to what they have to say. It's healthy to sort it out. It's healthy to remember and keep in mind that these descriptors, these re-understandings, and these elements of Christian life and spirituality are rooted and grounded in their orthodox understanding of the faith and their experiences in these visions or in the voices or in these revelations that they seem to have. And most of what we're going to get from them is totally re-understood, reimagined around these revelatory experiences, right? So, Julian of Norwich, then. Pause now and go get some biographical information and then come back. Or listen first and then go get your biography and line it all up. It's up to you. Julian of Norwich. Her name is actually Juliana. It's her given name, but we know her as Julian of Norwich. Seems to be what she went by, at least in her adult life. She's an individual in church history that we refer to as an anchorite, or an anchoress. Basically, She anchored herself to a given manner of life and a given location. And it looks like this. An anchorite, or in this case, an anchoress, is someone who enters a life of seclusion, solitude, for spiritual purposes in a fixed location. So this isn't somebody sort of like the Desert Fathers or the Desert Mothers who would have lived a secluded or a solitude sort of based life, but sort of meandered about, could go from place to place and do whatever. And an anchoress or an anchorite would have been somebody who decided, I'm going to live in this room, in this location, intentionally detached from other people and in solitude in order to grow spiritually. So someone who enters a life of seclusion and solitude for spiritual purposes in a fixed location, thus anchored. Now, this is distinct from somebody like a hermit. Typically, hermits leave society. They go out someplace away from the core of society. Anchorites or anchoress typically walled themselves in, created or made use of some sort of small room or cell attached to a church. Julian is one such individual. Julian anchored herself to a room, a walled-in space in Norwich, England. Now, the church has been named St. Julian's Church after Julian of Norwich. That's not exactly helpful. It was the church in Norwich, and she joined herself to the church and decided she wanted to live this way in particular. And when she did, they either made use of an existing or built her a specific room in or attached to the church, and that's where she spent basically the rest of her life. She was anchored to St. Julian's Church in Norwich, England, as a mystic Christian, think isolated within the walls and confines of the church, like a desert father or mother. She has a spiritual intention here. Her goal is to be detached from the world and be connected and anchored to Christ by physically being anchored to the church. And that space created there is supposed to give her the opportunity to live in solitude, secluded from the world around her, and in communion with God. That's the whole goal. Okay. Now, what transpires in her life is what leads to these visionary experiences for Julian of Norwich. And that's this. At the age of 30, she becomes very sick, exceptionally sick. So sick that everybody involved believed she was going to die. And she's dealing with this sickness and this reality that everybody around and in whatever limited context she has thinks that she's going to die and it's all going to be over. However, in a kind of miraculous way, she recovers and has what she called a series of 14 showings or revelations of Jesus Christ. And they are visionary experiences. She doesn't seem to describe it like she's sitting in the room and physically sees Jesus, kind of like the bright light of Joan of Arc, where it seemed to be something that was present with her here and now, or like the light on the road to Damascus. The way she describes it is a kind of visionary or spiritual experience. And so maybe we're thinking of something kind of like what we see in the book of Revelation, or something like Daniel in these dreams and visions. And so it seems more visionary than it seems to be something concrete in front of her that she saw and experienced. So she's basically at the point of death and miraculously begins to recover. And somewhere between that point of death and a full recovery, she has 14 revelations where she encounters Jesus in some capacity. And after she's made a full recovery from her illness, she has 2 more. So she ends up with a total of 16 showings. That's what she calls them. And even in her very sick condition, she writes down what it is that she's experiencing. Okay. And so she starts to document these visionary experiences and encounters with Jesus in this vision that she has, or the series of visions that she has. However, once she's made a full recovery, she goes back and she starts reviewing these recorded visions and these experiences, and she rewrites the vision and the experience and adds some kind of theological reflection. The theological reflection is the teaching material. This is where we start to pick up on what she is understanding of Jesus based on what she's experiencing in the vision, and then from there draw theological conclusions. And so we're going to spend a lot of our time over the next couple of days talking about Julian of Norwich, talking about the theology that she addresses. What is it that Jesus is drawing out of Julian of Norwich theologically that drives forward something that matters to us? Okay. And first, she has these theological reflections. Chief amongst that reflection, and in her description of her experiences with Jesus, she describes Jesus as loving, kind, and as a suffering servant. A lot of her visions describe her encounter with Jesus as Jesus being someone who suffers along with her suffering in her illness. Okay. And this is a bit interesting in terms of the perspective of the scripture, and a bit interesting in terms of the history. And this is where her biography is going to matter. In the 11th and the 12th centuries, the Black Death is a real deal thing. And there's a lot of theological focus and discussion revolving around the character of God and the nature of Jesus Christ as somebody like us in his humanity, who understands what it's like to suffer as a human person because of his crucifixion and his trial. And so there's a long-standing is a bit, I don't know. There's a common understanding in the 11th and 12th centuries in the church of Jesus as an individual who suffers along with people who are suffering, who is sharing their circumstance and situation, who is embracing with them this life of suffering, perhaps even this life of poverty. And Julian's understanding of Jesus in that regard is consistent with this couple hundred years where Europe is dominated by an understanding of Jesus, that is, he suffers along with us, because it seems Europe is being dominated by the plague and the Black Death. And these huge disease-ridden periods where hundreds, thousands, and millions of people die in history often get accompanied by focal points on Christ, especially, and on God as somebody who suffers along with the suffering of his people and his creation. And Julian's primary driving focus is that Jesus is someone who is with us in the midst of the difficulty, the struggle, and the circumstance we walk through. Jesus doesn't just sort of leave us alone and to our own devices. Jesus is somebody who walks with us, who suffers in our place, but suffers with us as well. And that's incredibly important for the character sketch that she's going to lay out for Jesus. Because in that regard, Jesus is gracious, he's loving, he's tender-hearted, he cares, and he cares so much that he doesn't just sort of stand at a distance and try and make it better for us, but he enters our lives in those moments. He joins us in it. And for Julian, he joined her in these visionary experiences. And so that's kind of what we're looking at here. Her understanding of Jesus as, to use the language of Hebrews, as a high priest who's sympathetic to our life experiences is built on the fact that her encounters with Jesus in her visions is sympathetic to her sickness. We are going to take a look at her theological reflections, and we're going to take a look at what she has to say along the way. But this is kind of where we're headed. All right. You now have time, if you didn't already, to go get some of that biographical information and start piecing it together. If you did that already and you've paused the video, then now you have time left to work on your project. If you get to a point where the project is accomplished or whatever, then work on those memory verses. If you've accomplished the project and you've accomplished the memory verses and all is right and well with the world, then you need to find something quiet and productive to work on. Okay. We will pick up with Julian of Norwich and some of the specifics Monday. All right. Have a good weekend, guys.